My name is Jarek Langer. I am a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and I am part of the research papers team for the conference. It is my pleasure today to welcome Heidi Pallarano and Stephanie Francis, who will be talking about understanding Hispanic fandom. And just in terms of logistics, we're going to have about 20 minutes for the presentation, and then about 5 minutes for questions. Raise your hand, I will get you the microphone, and just make sure you speak loudly into the mic so everyone can hear the questions. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Heidi Pallarano and Stephanie Francis.
I lost the battle of sitting down. All right, guys, thank you very much for coming. Hopefully this will be an engaging panel, so feel free. I know they say questions at the end, but I don't mind getting interrupted throughout the presentation. People are telling me, be careful what you wish for. I see the faces, but this is something that's an important topic that we wanted to share with you guys today. That's why we engage in this study, to make sure that we move the discussion forward. A little bit background on myself. I'm a senior vice president consultant at Wasserman Media Group, and I focus on segment marketing for our company.
And I am Stephanie Francis. I'm the co-founder of Navigate Research. Spoiler alert, I am not a Hispanic fan myself. However, I am a big fan of sports. In fact, my headshot is in front of my favorite fan moment from the '99 Women's World Cup. I always talked about how I didn't quite understand fans, how crazy and intense they get after having been an athlete. And I had that moment with that shot with Brandi Chastain where I was screaming and out of my head crazy. So certainly understand the connection to being a fan. So I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to kick us off and talk about why this study was so important and why it was needed.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's start off with, let's get a little bit of a sense of who's in the room. How many people are from teams or leagues? Great. How many people are from brands? Agencies? And then the rest students? Awesome. So we'll try to make sure that we customize as we go along to make sure that the information is applicable to you. So one of the things that we wanted to really start talking about is the stats here that you see. I guess it will be to my right, to your left. This is the basic information that most people know about the Hispanic market. But this is really what sets the baseline of why it's an important consumer segment, right? You're talking about size, with over 55 million Hispanics in the US. You're talking about purchasing power. This is the part that most people don't realize. We're talking about $1.2 trillion in purchasing power that I think everybody here that's in the business of growing revenue would want to get a piece of it. The other thing that you're going to see is when you look and project towards the future, Hispanics are driving 60% of the population growth in this country. So that's a very significant, and that's when you start thinking about people projecting the census for 2050, that the minority is going to be the majority, the new majority in this country, and it's driven by this population growth. The other thing that you're going to realize as we go through it is that most people think that the growth is coming from immigration, but the reality of it is it's not. 60% are US born. In 2013 was the first year that the net immigration was 0. So there were more immigrants coming in, the same amount of immigrants coming in that left this country because of the economic impact that was going through the recession, right? So that tells you a little bit of a sense of when we start talking about the future, the type of consumer we're really speaking about. The other thing that so why do we then do this study? We know it's an important market, but the information, when we are trying to service our clients, we really struggle. We always want to make sure that everything we do is based on data, not our own personal experience as Hispanic fans, because we're not always the target demo. So one of the things we really found was a lot of the information is outdated. You never want to go into a client with a presentation and says, here's what we're going to do, and then at the bottom when you put the source, 2010 or 2008, right? That never really helps you, especially when you know that the market is changing so quickly. The other thing we found is not segmented. We talk to a lot of clients when they come in and say, I want to win Hispanics. And we say, who? Right? If you segment the general market, male, female, by age, why wouldn't you do that with the Hispanic segment? The other thing we notice is males. It's only males, right? It's the Hispanic sports fan, but it's always male. So apparently Hispanic women like myself do not like sports and don't have disposable income that you guys want to get for your teams and leagues. And then the other part we found was it wasn't deep enough, right? People say Hispanics love soccer. So my answer was, which soccer? Is it the Mexican national team? Is it the Mexican league? Is it La Liga? Is it EPL? So that's really was a lot of the questions that we're facing as, as marketers, that there's not a lot of answers out there in the marketplace. So that's what we really set out to do. So let's start with kind of level setting this to make sure, like a lot of times, a lot of people kind of come in, they listen to us and they go, this is great, but they stop and not realize how important this is to their business. So let's start with this little image for us. I don't know which markets are represented here, but one of the things that's always very important is most people say, oh, I don't live in Texas or I don't live in Florida, so it's not really relevant to me. But look at the fastest growing Hispanic markets in this country. It's not what is called the traditional Beltway states. So for me personally, when I moved to this country, I moved to North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Biggest shock of my life. Well, they would have somebody over there cheering, that's great. Are you a Tar Heel? I'm a Dookie, so we'll talk about it later. But the one thing that was really amazing, when we moved to North Carolina, I won't say how many years ago, but we couldn't find rice and beans in our local supermarket. We used to drive an hour to Fort Bragg, which was the military base, to be able to get Hispanic food. You come now to North Carolina, the growth in population for the Hispanic population over the last 10, 15 years is over 300%. You go to Chapel Hill, you go to Raleigh, you go to Charlotte, these are significant changes. So if you're a team in Seattle, this is important. It's the 9th fastest growing Hispanic market. So that's one of the things that we want to make sure that you understand, that this is changing and it's changing everywhere, so it's important for you guys to take notice. The other thing is, I've had a lot of conversations, especially with teams, that they say, I don't know how important it is to me, right? I'm doing well with my season tickets, or I have a full house, and Hispanics tend to be cash transaction. They don't like to buy season tickets. And my answer back to them is always, is that all you sell? Right? No, at the end of the day, as a business, you have a number of revenue streams, from ticket sales to sponsorships to camps. You have your media partners, you have digital content, and you have merchandise. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight here is the importance of this segment to all of these particular parts. So think about it, for example, how many of you have seen in a lot of upcoming conferences how to win with millennials, right? That's the biggest topic of conversation now in a lot of these upcoming conferences. Well, do you know who are the millennial population in this country? They're multicultural. They're Hispanic. So over 20% of this country's Hispanic population, of the millennial population, is Hispanic. Why? Because 1 in 4 moms in this country is of Hispanic descent. And that's just the mom. When you add to that the mixed marriages, et cetera, that number is going to continue to grow. Sponsorship. When you're trying to craft a sponsorship, you're trying to really derive something that's a win-win situation. So a lot of industries have really said, for us to be able to build our business moving forward, we want to win with a Hispanic consumer. The personal care category, beauty, baby products, automotive, beverages. So if you're sitting there in a sponsorship department and you're saying, I have the right answer for you, beverage company, and you do not provide a solution for the Hispanic market, you're missing a huge opportunity to create a great sponsorship partnership. The other thing is camps. Again, you're trying to attract a demographic that's what, in the 5 to 18 years range. So when you think about the fact that 33% compared to 24% of the Hispanics are under 18, that's a significant group of people that you're trying to draw to your camps. And et cetera, it goes from there. Look at it very quickly from a media perspective. There's been over 20 channels that have launched over the last 10 plus years that are specific to Spanish language, because they're understanding the opportunity. And you see it all the time when they announce the new media rights deals. On the digital front, when you start thinking about it, a lot of times people don't think that Hispanics, and that's something we'll share with the study, are not that necessarily technology savvy. They actually are leading the industry when it comes to that. Why? Because Hispanics, their families are spread. Their friends are spread. So what's the best way for you to stay in touch? To have the latest technology and use social media to communicate and stay. So when you look at some of these statistics, this is 73% of Hispanics are on Facebook, 34% are on Instagram, and 25% are on Twitter. And that over-indexes against the general population. And then lastly, specific to merchandise, 3/4 of surveyed Hispanics said they have bought merchandise recently. They're very passionate about their favorite athletes and their favorite teams and clubs.
Because we were getting a lot of those same questions over the years from brands or from properties or from agencies who really wanted to understand the Hispanic fan. And they would come and they would say, we really absolutely need to understand this. And when we would design the study, every time it just became too expensive, despite the need for it to be done, which is why we were grateful to partner with Wasserman, because we were able to do an incredibly large syndicated study that would be able to be accessible to everybody, could purchase, and be able to look at a wide range of components and things related to the Hispanic fan. So I'm going to step back and look at more of our methodology just for a quick second. And I know this is where everybody else besides the researcher falls asleep. And I know that there's some students in the room, and a quick story is when I should have known I was meant to be a researcher at your age. I was a junior in college, and I was home for spring break, and the new Phoenix Suns arena at the time had just opened up. This was 20 years ago. It was the America West Arena. And a friend of mine had gone down there and had consumed a little bit of alcohol, even though we weren't quite of age. And the next thing I knew, I was being questioned by an officer, and my friend was being questioned by a different officer. And he said to me, ma'am, how many beers have you purchased from this arena? And I looked at him and I said, none. And he goes, how many has your friend purchased? And I said, one. And he goes, you're telling me between the two of you, you've had one beer? And I said, no, sir, that's not what you asked. And I should have known that I was inclined to be a researcher, to be sure that things were set up correctly, asked correctly, in a way that gives us actionable, usable results. So our study, as Heidi talked about, looks at in depth about the difference between acculturated Hispanics and unacculturated Hispanics. And we define that by language spoken at home. I know in different industries that's calculated and set up different ways, but that's how we chose to do it with some research. And what was important to that, because a lot of people when they came in, our brand and property clients, when they came in asking about the Hispanic fan, they said, well, how do we reach these people because they only show up at the ticket box with cash and purchase their tickets? There's no way to track them. And we knew instinctively that this wasn't totally correct, which is what was driving our deep dive into the acculturation status, which we'll show it here in just a second. 50% men and 50% women. As Heidi alluded to, a lot of times women are underrepresented, especially in fan studies, but in the Hispanic culture, it's incredibly important in terms of decision-making and purchasing power. And then the millennial component, incredibly large, 18 to 35 age group that's changing the way things are happening in sports, but especially when it comes to being a Hispanic fan. So to give you just a little bit of a snippet of what we're looking at and what the study provides, one thing I will tell you is that there's two components of the study that anybody can purchase, and one is going to be a dynamic tool. So every single component of this study, from every athlete that we looked into, every team, every purchasing decision, can all be sliced and diced at your own control and fingertips, which is unique and exciting because you'll have the power of this entire report for your own needs at your fingertips. And I looked at this slide and I laughed because this is researchers trying to make research sexy. Like that subtle 80s advertising. Like, do you feel it? Are you excited? Can you wait? Here we go. Let me just give you a high level before I turn it back over to Heidi to talk about how this is being used specifically at Wasserman. But this middle category you'll look at, this is the fan status by sport. And we asked for soccer, there's a soccer ball versus the league, because that's how we asked it in this particular question, because there's so many teams and leagues for soccer that we did dive into, but we clumped them all together. And the general market, or the general sports market, really thinks that this middle section, the unacculturated fan, is all Hispanics, that they all love soccer, and that's all that matters. But when we really looked and sliced and diced the difference between the Cuban American population, that's a 10 million person segment, it's actually baseball. And soccer isn't on there at all. So how would you, as a brand or a team, market differently to the Cuban Americans than you would to possibly Hispanics overall, which in that case we're looking at football, the NFL comes up top. Next, and Heidi touched on this, digital usage is significantly greater amongst the Hispanic fan, and they are using their smartphones and smart TVs to connect to sports at a greater rate than all other ethnicities. And they're also sharing content and more active on social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter. And I happen to live in Arizona, so I'm not sure, this doesn't really account the llama outing up here in the upper left. But I did have an odd moment of being from Arizona when I first heard about that, and I thought to myself, I should call my friend with llamas and be sure that those aren't hers. And I realized that's weird. And I was serious. So Hispanic fans are interacting and using and saving llamas and supporting their sports teams It was actually not necessarily the Hispanics that were chasing the llamas. It was the rest of us weirdos. Looking into actually attendance and spend once in arena, it is significantly higher amongst the Hispanic fan, which is also not part of the original hypothesis or the hypothesis of the general sports marketplace. So 23% of Hispanics are attending live events versus 17% of non-Hispanics. And same thing with spending once you're in the arena. ESPN did a story relatively recently about the impact of Tony Romo with the new stadium and how fans were driving 8 to 10 hours to come to see a Cowboys game live. And he was born in the States. His family had come from Mexico, but he was born in San Diego. And there's still that passion and allegiance to the Hispanic fan and the Hispanic athlete. And last thing I'll talk about is going to be the impact of that brand connection with a particular player, team, or league. And Hispanic fans are actually significantly more likely to trust that team or league and that brand because they're in conjunction with each other. So the connection and the power of the Hispanic fan is huge. And Heidi, back to you for talking about how this all matters in your day-to-day life.
Thank you. All right. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is that we left you with something that is actionable, and not just the stats, but provide you the right context to it. So one of the things that you heard us say is segment the market. Hopefully you saw that. One of the reasons we wanted to show that statistic about comparing the broader Hispanic market, which is how much most teams speak, so that you already see how they're missing the mark compared to the unacculturated, and then also the Cuban Americans. And we selected that because we knew it was going to show the breadth of interest. So if you are a marketer that's trying to market your product in Miami, you're going to have a different strategy than if you're trying to market your product in Chicago or Phoenix, where the demographics are completely different. So that's the first thing that we always encourage people is understand who your consumer is. It's the same practice that you would do with the general market, but make sure you take that rigor to do that as well in the Hispanic market. National versus local, this is the same thing we were talking about. When you have tiny budgets, we understand that, so you have to go for a national, something that works at the national level. So a lot of the things that we talk about is identifying those, what we call universal truths. There are certain universal truths that will not alienate any single Hispanic based on their ethnic origin, but are uniting factors. These are things like the love of family, in some instances, love for religion, food and music, and all of just the general kind of sense of family and friends that are very critical. So when you're trying to market at the national level, really focus on those universal truths. But if your budget allows, then really be able to bring that to the right context at the local level. If you are in New York and want to talk to a Dominican population, or if you are trying to talk to a Mexican, or even we talked to one of the teams in San Antonio, and they're trying to figure out, they were very successful marketing in that market, but all of a sudden their demographics are changing from being a predominantly Mexican American to being a more Central American. So now they're trying to figure out, how are Salvadorans different, and how do I build and develop my strategy specifically for them? The other thing is year-round exposure. We always joke, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but we always joke like people celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, and then they said we did a Hispanic marketing campaign. Well, most of us don't celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, right? Hispanic Heritage Month was created to celebrate the independence of certain Latin American countries, but that doesn't apply to all of us. Also, Cinco de Mayo is not a true Hispanic holiday. Most people don't even understand what Cinco de Mayo is. I actually sat and watched an argument with somebody saying that it's the independence of Mexico. It is not. So those are the things that we always try to talk to people. Hispanics are Hispanics year-round, 365 days. And there's some real missed opportunities, right? You talked about this, the love of family. How many times have you sat there and saw a team during the season do a campaign for mom, but really single out the Hispanic mom? Halloween, how many teams are in business, operating during Halloween? You saw the percentage of kids in this country that are Hispanic. When was the last time you saw a campaign specific to that? So there's a lot of opportunities out there to really create marketing campaigns that go year-round. Authentic. This is, a lot of times it's fascinating because I always equate Hispanics a little bit to millennials. You always hear how millennials are very skeptical of marketing. So are Hispanics, right? Because they know when they're just a box being checked, versus when somebody really is interested in really building their business with them. One of the things that I was very impressed when I talked to the Miami Heat is that they said our approach was to build trust first before selling. So those are some of the last key things that we want to talk about. Educate before selling. If you are specifically a product that is very different from something that they are used to consuming, think about season tickets. That's a completely different perspective if you are in a Brazil or if you are in a Mexico. So if you cannot bring that right context to somebody to say why you need to make this investment, they're not going to understand why they need to make that kind of commitment. So education is very important, and then relationship. You know, if you look at it, it's a very tight-knit community where there's a lot of people that outreach and go for advice, and that's why they're constantly on social media looking for reviews and things like that. The same thing applies, and I think yesterday in the presentation with Google, they talked about it too, from the purchase to a ticket, right? There's a lot of information gathering that goes into making that decision, so it's important for us to make sure that you establish that opportunity to go in, build a relationship, get into the community before you go in and say, please buy our season tickets, please buy our merchandise, please get to our camps. Why should they be supporting your business? Start there, and the rest will follow. So I think we're ready for Q&A.
Awesome. Please join me in thanking Heidi and Stephanie, and we'll do Q&A as well.
Can you sit for this? Yes. Can you sit? Yes.
Oh, wow. You have questions.
Hi there, great presentation, guys. Quick question about year-round exposure. Have you seen any impact with some of those bigger sweeping programs like you mentioned Hispanic Heritage Month, things that the NFL or NBA does? Is there any bump in there for Hispanic media consumption or anything like that, or does it stay flat and people generally do the local or more year-round things?
Yeah. So, you know, there's a couple of leagues that have really embraced the Hispanic consumer and have really developed, year-long platforms that have specific heat moments, right? So the NFL is one example of that. They actually have a pretty broad Hispanic platform that has media components as well as on-the-field components and camps and things like that, because their research has found that, to become an NFL fan, it starts when you're in your 10 to 15 years old, so they know they have to get them early to be able to make sure they're avid fans for the long haul. So they've invested in programs that have heat moments. Same thing with the NBA, with the NBA platform, and this is one that they actually took the time and did their research, identified that they wanted to go after the bicultural, bilingual Hispanic, and created a platform around that, and then they used things like Hispanic Heritage Month to have specific heat moments. I think there's a lot that could continue to be done to expand on the social media components in terms of the content that it's out there. But there's some instances where you're seeing it. For the most part, there's still a lot of room for growth.
Thanks so much. So I'm at Harvard Business School, and when I've shown similar type of data to my professors in strategy or marketing, or even our professor that leads the strategic marketing and creative industries, they say, well, this is interesting, but at the end of the day, Hispanics will just converge to the tastes of most Americans. You have the blockbuster theory that people say, if you spend enough money, it doesn't really matter, they'll consume the content. Can you speak a little bit more to that skepticism, and have you seen it? Obviously, folks are asking for this data, but how do you kind of combat that skepticism or show that, no, this is actually a group that's big enough that is actually defining new trends, and then also that counter of, well, it's 1.2 trillion, but when you break it out into every single subgroup of Latino, how do you actually segment that and actually have a national campaign for that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that's been done on this, and there's two things that are happening. There's a phenomenon called reacculturation, right? Retroacculturation, sorry. What means is, if you think about it from a psychological perspective, when the Hispanics were coming here and they were true minority, you were told to assimilate, right? You don't want to get beat up in a school and stuff like that. There's a lot of Hispanics that are in their 40s and 50s that talk about they're remembering when they moved to this country and their parents were trying to make sure that they were Americanized. But the reality is, as the numbers have grown, retroacculturation has happened, right? So Hispanics, especially a lot of this generation, misses the fact that their kids do not speak the language, that they have lost connection with their heritage. So now you see all of these parents are bringing that back. and making sure that these kids take Spanish, their kids are eating this food, and because of that, there's strengths in numbers. The one thing is a recent research study showed that over 78% of Hispanic millennials believe that Hispanic traditions are important to maintain and pass on to the next generation. So that's my big differentiation when I talk to somebody like that. That was true, that hypothesis was true 10, 15 years ago. It doesn't hold true anymore.
And I think as it relates to the sports business world specifically, as we watch this study year over year, and with the population growth that Heidi pointed out in the country, as we watch and be able to compare the acculturated Hispanic group to non-Hispanics, we're going to be able to track and test that over time. So it's a good thing that we started it now as things are continuing to grow.
So that's unfortunately all the time that we have. So please join me again in thanking Heidi and Stephanie for the presentation.